Welcome, friend. As the evening settles around us and the world grows quiet, I invite you to journey back with me through time, to an era when bringing life into the world was perhaps the most dangerous thing a woman could do. Tonight, we'll explore a question that might seem simple on the surface, but holds within it centuries of fear, hope, and profound human struggle. Why did bringing life so often mean courting death in the Middle Ages? As you settle in, perhaps with a warm drink at your side, know that we'll be walking together through three particular horrors that defined medieval childbirth. First, we'll discover how infection stalked every birth chamber, unseen and unnamed, claiming lives with ruthless efficiency. Second, we'll witness how hemorrhage could transform joy into tragedy in mere moments, with no understanding of how to stem the flow. And finally, we'll uncover how superstition and religious doctrine, though meant to provide comfort, often stood in the way of life-saving knowledge. Before we descend into these darker waters, let me paint for you the world in which these stories unfold. Picture, if you will, Europe between the years 1100 and 1500. This is a world where the average person, if they were fortunate enough to survive childhood, might expect to live perhaps 35 to 40 years. Life was precarious in ways that are difficult for us to imagine. A simple cut could become infected and prove fatal. A broken bone might never heal properly, leaving its victim permanently disabled. Diseases that we now prevent with simple vaccines could devastate entire communities. This was a time when the Catholic Church held sway over nearly every aspect of daily life, from the foods people ate to the prayers they whispered in their darkest hours. The Church's influence extended into the birthing chamber itself, shaping not only the spiritual practices surrounding birth, but also the medical understanding of pregnancy and labor. Priests blessed birthing stools, midwives took sacred oaths, and the salvation of unbaptized souls drove desperate surgical interventions. It was a world without understanding of germs or bacteria, where illness was often attributed to divine punishment, the influence of malevolent spirits, or the misalignment of celestial bodies. The very concept that tiny, invisible creatures could cause disease and death would have seemed like madness to most medieval minds. Instead, they looked to the balance of bodily humors, the position of the stars, and the spiritual state of the sufferer to explain sickness and health. Women existed largely in the shadows of legal and social structures, their worth often measured primarily by their ability to bear children, particularly sons who could carry on family names and inherit property. A woman's legal identity was typically subsumed under that of her father or husband, and her access to education, property, and social mobility was severely limited. In this context, pregnancy and childbirth represented both a woman's primary social function and her greatest existential threat. In this world, certain words carried weight and meaning that we've largely forgotten. When a woman was with child, she would eventually enter what was known as her lying-in period, a time of confinement that could last weeks or even months. This wasn't simply about rest. It was about ritual purification and spiritual protection. The lying-in period was seen as necessary to protect both mother and child from evil influences and to prepare the woman for the dangerous passage of birth. After birth, if she survived, she would undergo a ceremony called churching, a religious ritual that would cleanse her and allow her to re-enter society and, importantly, to return to her husband's bed. The churching ceremony was based on the biblical account of Mary's purification after the birth of Jesus, and it reinforced the medieval belief that childbirth was somehow polluting, requiring spiritual cleansing before a woman could fully participate in Christian society again. The women who attended births were typically midwives, though the distinction between a midwife and other healers was often blurred. These were women who learned their craft through apprenticeship and experience, passing down knowledge through generations of spoken word and careful observation. A skilled midwife was a valuable member of any community, possessing knowledge of herbs, prayers, and practical techniques that could mean the difference between life and death. Occasionally, particularly in cases involving wealthy families, a barber surgeon might be called upon, though their presence often signaled that death was already knocking at the door. Barber surgeons were men who combined the trades of hair-cutting, tooth-pulling, and basic surgery. Their knowledge of anatomy was limited, their instruments crude, and their understanding of infection non-existent. When they were summoned to a birth, it was usually to perform the grisly task of removing a dead baby from its mother's womb, or to attempt a cesarean section on a dying woman. To understand why childbirth was so perilous, we must first understand how medieval people viewed the female body and the process of creating life. Their knowledge was built upon the foundation of ancient Greek and Roman texts, particularly the works of Galen, a physician whose theories dominated medical thinking for over 1,000 years. According to Galenic theory, the human body was governed by 4 humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Health depended on maintaining the proper balance of these humors, and pregnancy was seen as a time when this balance was particularly fragile. The 4 humors were associated with different temperaments and physical qualities. Blood was hot and wet, linked to a sanguine temperament. Phlegm was cold and wet, associated with a phlegmatic nature. Yellow bile was hot and dry, connected to a choleric disposition. Black bile was cold and dry, linked to melancholy. Women were generally considered to be colder and wetter than men, which was thought to make them more susceptible to certain diseases and to explain their supposed emotional instability. During pregnancy, physicians believed that the woman's humoral balance shifted dramatically. The growing child was thought to draw heat and moisture from the mother's body, potentially causing an excess of cold, dry humors that could lead to melancholy or other ailments. This understanding led to dietary recommendations designed to restore balance. Warming foods and drinks for women thought to be too cold, cooling remedies for those considered too hot. Aristotle's influence was equally profound and even more demeaning to women. His teaching suggested that men provided the hot seed that gave life and form to a child, while women contributed only the cold matter in which that seed could grow. This wasn't merely academic theory. It shaped how people understood pregnancy, birth, and the very nature of male and female roles in society. The woman's body was seen as a vessel, important but passive, and her emotional and spiritual state was believed to directly influence the developing child. This Aristotelian view had profound implications for how society treated pregnant women. Since they were seen as passive containers rather than active participants in the creation of life, their own health and well-being was often considered secondary to the welfare of the child they carried. Women were expected to endure any discomfort or danger for the sake of their unborn children, and their own desires or fears were often dismissed as unimportant. Medieval physicians and midwives believed that a pregnant woman's thoughts, fears, and experiences could literally shape her unborn child. If she was frightened by a fire, the child might be born with a birthmark resembling flames. If she craved strawberries and touched her face while thinking of them, the child might bear a strawberry-shaped mark. If she witnessed a violent crime, her child might be born with a predisposition toward violence. This belief placed enormous pressure on pregnant women to maintain not just physical health, but perfect emotional and spiritual composure. These beliefs about maternal impressions extended to almost every aspect of a pregnant woman's life. She was warned against looking at deformed animals lest her child be born with similar deformities. She was told to avoid funerals and other sad occasions, as exposure to grief might cause her child to be born melancholic. Even her reading material was restricted. Romantic poetry might make her child overly amorous, while violent tales could create a warrior's temperament. The recommended diet for pregnant women reveals much about medieval understanding of nutrition and health, as well as the practical limitations faced by most families. Ale was considered essential, not just for its supposed nutritional value, but because it was often safer to drink than water. The brewing process, while not understood in terms of sterilization, did kill many harmful bacteria, making ale a relatively safe beverage. For pregnant women, ale was often mixed with herbs thought to strengthen the womb or ease labor pains. Pottage, a thick porridge made from grains and whatever vegetables or meat could be obtained, formed the basis of most meals. For pregnant women, pottage might be enriched with eggs, honey, or small amounts of meat when available. The consistency was thought to be important. Foods that were too hard might harm the developing child, while very soft foods were considered ideal for pregnant women. Red meat was believed to strengthen the blood, which was thought to be particularly important during pregnancy. However, For most medieval families, meat was a luxury that appeared on the table only occasionally. Chicken was considered especially beneficial for pregnant women, as it was thought to provide both nourishment and warmth to the developing child. Fish was also recommended, particularly during the many fast days prescribed by the Church. Dairy products occupied a complex place in medieval pregnancy diet. Fresh milk was considered excellent for pregnant women, but it was often difficult to obtain and preserve safely. Cheese was more commonly available and was thought to provide strength and nourishment. However, certain types of cheese were avoided, as they were believed to cause the child to be born with skin problems. What pregnant women were forbidden to consume or experience is equally telling about medieval medical beliefs. Cold baths were strictly prohibited, as cold was believed to harm the developing child by disrupting the delicate balance of humors. This prohibition extended to cold foods and drinks, which were thought to make the womb too cold for the child to develop properly. Even cold air was considered dangerous, leading to the practice of keeping pregnant women in warm, stuffy rooms. Lunar eclipses were considered particularly dangerous, with pregnant women warned to stay indoors and avoid looking at the darkened moon. The belief was that the eclipse represented a cosmic disturbance that could mark or harm unborn children. During eclipses, pregnant women were often required to remain in darkened rooms, sometimes for hours, until the celestial event had passed. Loud noises were thought to startle the unborn child and potentially cause it to be born deaf or nervous. This belief led to restrictions on pregnant women attending festivals, markets, or other noisy gatherings. Even the ringing of church bells was sometimes considered problematic, though this created a theological dilemma since church attendance was considered spiritually necessary. Certain foods were absolutely forbidden to pregnant women. Herbs like pennyroyal and tansy were known to cause miscarriages and were strictly avoided, though this knowledge also meant they were sometimes used by women seeking to end unwanted pregnancies. Spicy foods were thought to make the child hot-tempered, while sour foods might cause the child to be born with a difficult disposition. As a woman approached her time of delivery, preparations would begin in earnest, often weeks before the expected birth. The midwife played a central role in these preparations, and her responsibilities extended far beyond the medical. She was part healer, part spiritual guide, and part community organizer. The selection of a midwife was crucial, as her skill and experience could literally determine whether mother and child survived the birth. Most midwives took oaths, sometimes before church officials, swearing to practice their craft with honesty and to protect the lives of both mother and child. These oaths often included promises to perform emergency baptisms if necessary, to avoid using magic or superstitious practices, and to call for help from physicians or clergy when appropriate. The Church's involvement in regulating midwifery reflected both its concern for the spiritual welfare of mother and child and its desire to control women's activities. Many midwives incorporated prayers, charms, and blessed objects into their practice, walking a careful line between approved religious observance and forbidden superstition. A skilled midwife would know dozens of prayers for different situations. Prayers to ease labor pains, prayers to turn a breech baby, prayers to stop hemorrhaging, and prayers to protect both mother and child from evil influences. The birthing stool was perhaps the most important piece of equipment a midwife possessed. These were specially designed chairs with a horseshoe-shaped seat that allowed the mother to give birth in a squatting position, which was correctly understood to be more natural than lying flat. The use of birthing stools represented one of the few areas where medieval practice actually aligned with modern understanding of optimal birthing positions. Birthing stools were often family heirlooms, passed down from mother to daughter or from midwife to apprentice. They were frequently decorated with religious symbols, crosses, images of saints, or carved prayers. Some were painted with protective colors, usually red or blue, which were thought to ward off evil influences. The stool was sometimes blessed by a priest before use, and holy water might be sprinkled on it before each birth. However, like most medieval medical equipment, birthing stools were rarely properly cleaned between uses, making them potential sources of infection. The horsehair padding used to make them more comfortable harbored bacteria, and the wooden surfaces were impossible to sterilize with medieval methods. What should have been a helpful tool sometimes became an instrument of death. Clean linens were a luxury that few could afford, and the definition of clean was very different from modern standards. Most births took place on whatever bedding the family possessed, which might be straw covered with rough cloth or, in wealthier households, actual linen sheets. Even when families made efforts to provide clean bedding, their understanding of cleanliness was limited to what could be seen and smelled, not the invisible bacteria that posed the greatest threat. The preparation of birthing linens was often a community effort. Female relatives and neighbors would gather in the weeks before an expected birth to sew and prepare cloths for swaddling the baby and absorbing blood and other fluids during labor. These preparations were social occasions that allowed women to share advice, tell stories of previous births, and provide emotional support to the expectant mother. Holy relics played a crucial role in medieval birthing chambers, reflecting the profound spiritual dimension of childbirth in medieval society. These might include fragments of saints' bones, pieces of cloth that had touched religious artifacts, or written prayers and charms. The most prized relics were those associated with female saints who had died in childbirth, or who were particularly known for protecting women. The cult of Saint Margaret of Antioch was especially important for women in labor. According to legend, Margaret had been swallowed by a dragon but had burst free from its belly unharmed, making her a natural patron for women hoping to deliver their babies safely. Relics associated with Saint Margaret, whether genuine or not, were among the most valuable possessions a midwife could own. Other saints invoked during childbirth included Saint Dorothy, who was believed to ease labor pains, Saint Bridget of Ireland, who was thought to protect both mother and child, and Saint Anne, the mother of the Virgin Mary, who was called upon to ensure safe delivery. The stories of these saints were well known to medieval women, and their intercession was sought through prayers, offerings, and the use of relics. Written charms and prayers were also common in birthing chambers. These might be sewn into clothing, worn as amulets, or simply placed near the laboring woman. Many of these texts combined Christian prayers with older folk traditions, creating a syncretic spiritual practice that the Church sometimes tolerated and sometimes condemned. The line between approved religious practice and forbidden superstition was often unclear, even to church authorities. When labor began, neighbors would often gather to help, and their first task was usually to boil water. Contrary to what we might assume, this wasn't for sterilization purposes. The concept of sterilization didn't exist. Instead, the hot water was used to make warming drinks for the mother, to clean the baby after birth, and to create steam that was believed to help open the womb. The process of boiling water also served a social function, giving the gathered women something useful to do while they waited and worried. The birthing chamber would be filled with the scent of herbs like rue and rosemary, which were burned both for their supposed medicinal properties and to mask the odors of blood and bodily fluids. Rue was particularly valued for its ability to clear the air and was thought to drive away evil spirits that might harm mother or child. Rosemary was associated with remembrance and was burned to help the mother remember her prayers and stay focused during the pain of labor. Other herbs commonly used during labor included lavender for its calming properties, mint to ease nausea, and fennel to strengthen the mother and speed labor. These herbs were often combined in complex recipes that had been passed down through generations of midwives. While some of these herbal remedies may have had genuine medicinal benefits, many were ineffective or even harmful. The lighting in medieval birthing chambers was always dim, as candles and oil lamps were expensive and had to be used sparingly. This created an atmosphere that was both intimate and mysterious, but it also made it difficult for midwives to see clearly what was happening during labor. The flickering light of candles cast dancing shadows on the walls, adding to the sense of otherworldliness that surrounded the birth process. But despite all these preparations, despite the prayers and charms and careful attention to ancient wisdom, medieval childbirth was beset by complications that could turn deadly with frightening speed. The most common and perhaps most terrifying was obstructed labor, often caused by what we now call cephalopelvic disproportion. Simply put, cases where the baby's head was too large to pass through the mother's pelvis. Cephalopelvic disproportion was more common in medieval times than it is today for several reasons. First, maternal malnutrition was widespread, particularly among peasant families. Poor nutrition during childhood could result in underdeveloped pelvises, making obstructed labor more likely. Rickets, caused by vitamin D deficiency, was common and could cause pelvic deformities that made normal birth impossible. Second, women often became pregnant very young, sometimes before their pelvises had fully developed. The practice of early marriage, combined with social pressure to produce children quickly, meant that many women gave birth while their bodies were still growing. This increased the risk of obstructed labor and other complications. When labor became obstructed, the midwife had few options, and most of them were dangerous. She might try to manually reposition the baby, a procedure that was not only excruciating for the mother but also dangerous, as it could cause internal injuries or introduce infection. The midwife would wash her hands, not understanding that this wasn't enough to prevent infection, and attempt to grasp the baby's head or shoulders and guide it through the birth canal. If the baby was in a breech position, with its buttocks or feet presenting first instead of its head, attempting to turn it was even more perilous. Breech births were especially feared because they were more likely to result in complications for both mother and child. The midwife might try to grasp the baby's legs and pull it from the womb, but this often resulted in injury to the baby's spine or internal organs. In cases of severe obstructed labor, some midwives resorted to even more desperate measures. They might use hooks or other instruments to dismember the baby in the womb, allowing it to be delivered in pieces and potentially saving the mother's life. This procedure, called embryotomy, was agonizing for the mother and always fatal for the child. But it was sometimes the only way to prevent the mother's death. Postpartum hemorrhage was another swift killer that struck without warning. After the baby was born, the placenta needed to be delivered, and sometimes it would not separate properly from the uterine wall. This condition, known as placenta accreta, could cause catastrophic bleeding that would kill a woman in minutes. Without modern understanding of how to manage this emergency, midwives might try to pull the placenta out manually, often making the bleeding worse. Medieval midwives had no blood transfusions, no medications to contract the uterus, and no surgical techniques to stop hemorrhaging. They might try packing the uterus with cloths to absorb blood, but this often introduced infection. Some midwives attempted to stop bleeding by applying pressure to the woman's abdomen or by giving her herbal remedies that were supposed to contract the uterus. But these measures were rarely effective against severe hemorrhage. The lack of understanding about blood loss meant that even when bleeding could be controlled, women often died from shock and blood loss. A woman could bleed to death while her family watched helplessly, unable to understand why someone who had seemed healthy moments before was suddenly dying before their eyes. Perhaps most insidious was puerperal fever, what we now know as postpartum sepsis. This infection could take hold days or even weeks after birth, often starting with a fever and progressing to delirium and death. Medieval people had no understanding of bacteria or infection, so they couldn't comprehend why some women who had seemed to recover from childbirth would suddenly fall ill and die. Puerperal fever was often caused by bacteria introduced during labor by unclean hands or instruments, or by fragments of placenta left in the uterus. The infection would spread through the woman's bloodstream, causing fever, chills, and eventually organ failure. Medieval physicians attributed these symptoms to an imbalance of humors or to spiritual causes, prescribing treatments like bloodletting that often made the condition worse. The progression of puerperal fever was terrifying for families to witness. A woman who had successfully given birth and seemed to be recovering would suddenly develop a high fever. She might become delirious, speaking nonsense or failing to recognize her family members. Her breathing would become rapid and shallow, and her skin might take on a gray or yellow pallor. Within days or even hours, she would be dead. The absence of forceps, which wouldn't be invented until the 17th century, meant that when a baby became truly stuck, there was often no way to safely deliver it. Forceps, when properly used, can grasp a baby's head and gently guide it through the birth canal. But medieval midwives had no such tools. Instead, they might try to use their hands to grasp the baby and pull, but this frequently resulted in injury to both mother and child. Sometimes, in desperation, midwives would use crude instruments like hooks or knives to try to extract a stuck baby. These instruments were not designed for medical use and were often made by local blacksmiths or borrowed from other trades. Their use almost always proved fatal for the baby and often caused severe injuries to the mother as well. The psychological toll of attending births in medieval times was enormous for midwives. They were often blamed when births went wrong, even though they had no effective tools to deal with serious complications. A midwife might watch helplessly as women and babies died, knowing that there was nothing she could do to save them. The weight of these losses, combined with the constant fear of being accused of witchcraft or malpractice, made midwifery a profession that required extraordinary courage and resilience. Let me tell you the story of Marjorie, a composite character based on countless real women whose stories have been lost to time, but whose experiences represent the harsh realities faced by medieval mothers. Marjorie was 26 years old and about to give birth to her 5th child. She lived in a one-room cottage with her husband, who was a peasant farmer, and their 4 surviving children. She had already lost 2 babies in infancy, which was so common as to be almost expected. Marjorie's life had been shaped by the relentless cycle of pregnancy, birth, and loss that defined most women's experiences in medieval times. She had married at 14 to a man chosen by her father, and her first pregnancy had begun within months of the wedding. That first birth had been difficult, lasting nearly 2 days, but both she and the baby had survived. The child, a son, had lived only 6 months before succumbing to what we would now recognize as pneumonia. Her second pregnancy had resulted in a daughter who survived to adulthood, followed by a son who died at birth, then another daughter who lived, and another son who died in infancy. Each pregnancy had taken its toll on Marjorie's body, leaving her weaker and more prone to complications. Her diet consisted mainly of dark bread, ale, and whatever vegetables her family could grow or forage. She was shorter and thinner than women today, her body weakened by years of hard labor and poor nutrition. The cottage where Marjorie lived was typical of peasant dwellings in medieval Europe. It had one room that served as kitchen, living area, and bedroom for the entire family. The floor was dirt-covered with rushes that were changed only occasionally. There was one window covered with oiled cloth rather than glass, and a hole in the roof to allow smoke from the central fire to escape. The walls were made of wattle and daub, woven sticks covered with mud and straw, and provided little insulation against the cold. When her labor began on a cold October morning, Marjorie knew immediately that this birth would be different. The pains were sharper and more irregular than she remembered from her previous labors, and the baby seemed to be positioned unusually. Her husband sent their eldest child, a girl of 10, to fetch the village midwife, a woman named Agnes, who had been attending births for nearly 30 years. Agnes was one of the most respected women in the village, despite her humble origins. She had learned her craft from her own mother and had apprenticed with an older midwife who was said to have delivered over 1,000 babies during her long career. Agnes could neither read nor write, but she possessed a vast store of practical knowledge about childbirth, herbal medicine, and the spiritual practices that surrounded birth. Agnes arrived to find Marjorie pacing around the small cottage, her hands pressed against her lower back. The midwife had brought her birthing stool, a collection of herbs, and a small bag containing what she considered her most precious possessions. A piece of cloth that had supposedly touched the shroud of St. Margaret of Antioch, the patron saint of childbirth, and a written charm that she couldn't read but had been told would ease difficult labors. The birthing stool that Agnes carried was a family heirloom that had been passed down through 3 generations of midwives. It was made of oak and had been carved with symbols of protection, crosses, spirals, and images of saints. The horseshoe-shaped seat was padded with horsehair and covered with leather that had been blessed by the village priest. Despite its sacred nature, the stool harbored bacteria from previous births, making it a potential source of infection. As the hours passed, it became clear that this birth would not be easy. Marjorie's previous children had been born after labors lasting between 8 and 12 hours, but this time was different. The baby seemed to be positioned incorrectly, and despite Agnes's best efforts to encourage it to turn, progress was slow. The midwife had Marjorie walk, squat, and lie on her side, trying positions that previous experience had taught her might help. Agnes brewed teas from the herbs she had brought, raspberry leaf to strengthen the womb, chamomile to ease pain, and a mixture of other plants that her mentor had taught her to use. She burned rue and rosemary in the cottage's central fire, filling the small space with aromatic smoke that was supposed to protect mother and child from evil influences. She also placed her precious relic, the cloth associated with St. Margaret, on Marjorie's belly and recited the prayers she had memorized for difficult births. 24 hours into the labor, Marjorie was exhausted and beginning to fear for her life. The pains were becoming stronger and more frequent, but the baby still hadn't descended properly. Agnes could feel that the baby's head was presenting, but it seemed too large, or perhaps Marjorie's pelvis was too narrow. This was a complication that Agnes had seen before, and she knew that both mother and baby were in grave danger. The midwife tried several techniques to help the baby along. She massaged Marjorie's belly, attempting to encourage the baby to shift position. She had Marjorie squat over a pot of steaming water infused with herbs, believing that the warm vapors would help open the birth canal. She even tried a technique that her mentor had taught her, inserting her hand into the birth canal to try to grasp the baby's head and guide it down. As the labor stretched into its second day, neighbors began to gather. In medieval communities, difficult births were communal events. The women would pray together, share the work of keeping the fire going and providing food for the family, and support each other through what everyone understood could be a tragedy. Some brought additional herbs or charms, while others simply offered their presence and their prayers. The cottage became crowded with women of all ages, from teenage girls who were learning about childbirth to elderly grandmothers who had attended dozens of births. They took turns holding Marjorie's hands, wiping her face with cool cloths, and murmuring prayers and words of encouragement. The atmosphere was thick with smoke from the herbs being burned and heavy with the scent of unwashed bodies and anxiety. On the third day, after 36 hours of labor, Agnes made the decision to try to help the baby along manually. This was a dangerous procedure that could cause internal injuries or introduce infection, but she felt she had no choice. She washed her hands in the available water, not understanding that this wasn't enough to prevent infection, and attempted to grasp the baby's head and guide it through the birth canal. The procedure was agonizing for Marjorie, who bit down on a piece of leather to keep from screaming and disturbing the neighbors. Agnes worked carefully, trying to hook her fingers under the baby's chin and pull gently downward. She could feel that the baby was still alive, as it moved slightly in response to her touch, but it was clear that it was in distress. When the baby finally emerged, it was clear that it had been dead for some time. The umbilical cord had been wrapped around its neck, and the prolonged labor had proved fatal. The baby's skin was mottled and blue, and it showed no signs of life. Agnes quickly cut the cord with her small knife and delivered the placenta, which came away cleanly, suggesting that Marjorie might survive. But the difficult birth had caused internal injuries that Agnes couldn't see or understand. The prolonged pressure of the baby's head against Marjorie's pelvic bones had caused tissue damage, and the manual manipulation had created small tears in the birth canal. Though Marjorie lived, she developed what we now know as a vesicovaginal fistula, a tear between the bladder and birth canal that left her incontinent for the rest of her life. The aftermath of Marjorie's birth was typical of many difficult medieval deliveries. The dead baby was buried quickly and quietly, often without a formal funeral service, as infant mortality was so common that elaborate mourning rituals were impractical. Marjorie spent weeks recovering from her ordeal, during which time her female relatives cared for her other children and managed the household. The fistula that resulted from Marjorie's difficult labor was a complication that Agnes didn't understand and couldn't treat. Marjorie found herself constantly leaking urine, a condition that was not only physically uncomfortable, but also socially isolating. In a culture that placed great emphasis on cleanliness and godliness, incontinence was seen as a mark of shame, and Marjorie found herself gradually excluded from social activities. Marjorie's story represents thousands of similar experiences throughout medieval Europe. She was lucky to survive, but the physical and emotional toll of that birth marked her forever. She bore no more children, partly because of her injuries and partly because she and her husband feared another pregnancy. She lived another 15 years, always slightly apart from her community because of her condition, which was seen as a mark of God's displeasure. The psychological impact of losing children in birth or infancy was enormous, but medieval society had developed coping mechanisms that helped families deal with these losses. High infant mortality rates meant that parents often delayed forming strong emotional attachments to their children until they had survived their first few years. This emotional distance was a survival mechanism that protected parents from the devastation of repeated losses. But let us pause here for a moment, friend. I know these stories are heavy, and the weight of so much suffering can feel overwhelming. Take a breath with me and let your mind rest for just a moment. Listen to the quiet around you. Feel the safety of your surroundings, and remember that these are stories from a distant past, when humanity was still learning, still struggling to understand the mysteries of life and death. The medieval world was one of deep spiritual belief, where people found comfort in rituals and prayers, even when they couldn't change the outcome. In the birthing chambers of that time, you might have heard the soft recitation of ancient charms, words that had been passed down through generations of women who hoped they might hold some power over life and death. Let me share with you one such charm, translated from a 14th century manuscript. These words would have been whispered by candlelight, in rooms filled with the scent of herbs and the quiet breathing of women who understood that they were witnessing something that could change from miraculous to tragic in a heartbeat. Saint Margaret, holy maiden who emerged from the dragon's belly unharmed, protect this woman in her hour of trial. As you broke free from the beast that would devour you, so may this child break free from the womb that holds it. As you conquered the dragon with your faith, so may this mother conquer her pain with your blessing. Let the gates of her body open as the gates of paradise open for you. Let her strength be as your strength, her courage as your courage. Saint Margaret, pray for us, protect us, and deliver us from the dangers of this world. Amen. These words would be repeated over and over like a heartbeat, like a prayer, like a hope that refused to die even in the face of terrible odds. Sometimes the charm would be written on a piece of parchment and placed on the laboring woman's belly. Sometimes it would be recited while holy water was sprinkled around the birthing chamber. The exact ritual mattered less than the faith that it represented, the desperate human need to believe that suffering could be meaningful, that prayer could change outcomes, that love could triumph over death. Other charms focused on the practical aspects of birth, asking for divine assistance in opening the womb and easing the passage of the child. As Christ was born of the Virgin Mary without pain, so may this child be born without suffering. As the sun rises without effort, so may this birth proceed without struggle. As the flower opens to receive the morning dew, so may this woman's body open to release her child. By the power of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, let this birth be swift and safe. Amen. The repetitive nature of these charms served multiple purposes. For the laboring woman, they provided something to focus on during contractions, a way to transform pain into prayer. For the attendants, they offered a sense of agency in a situation where they were largely powerless. And for the community, they reinforced shared beliefs about the spiritual dimension of childbirth and the importance of collective prayer. The contrast between a peasant woman's experience and that of royalty reveals much about medieval society, but also shows how even wealth and power couldn't overcome the fundamental dangers of childbirth. Consider the experience of Queen Eleanor of Castile, wife of King Edward I of England, who bore 16 children over the course of her marriage. Despite having access to the finest physicians in Europe, despite birthing chambers furnished with silk and gold, despite prayers offered in the greatest cathedrals, Eleanor faced the same risks as any peasant woman. Royal births were elaborate affairs that could involve dozens of attendants and cost enormous sums of money. The Queen's chamber would be prepared weeks in advance, with the finest linens imported from Flanders, silver vessels for washing, and furniture crafted by the kingdom's best artisans. The walls might be hung with tapestries depicting scenes from the lives of saints, and the air would be perfumed with expensive aromatic resins like frankincense and myrrh, imported at great cost from distant lands. The queen's physicians would consult astrological charts to determine the most auspicious time for delivery, calculating the positions of planets and stars to ensure the best possible outcome. They might delay announcing the birth until celestial conditions were favorable, or recommend specific times for the queen to begin her lying-in period. These calculations were taken seriously at the highest levels of government, as the timing of a royal birth could have implications for succession and political stability. Despite all this luxury and attention, royal women died in childbirth at rates similar to their peasant counterparts. The elaborate preparations and expensive treatments often did more harm than good. Royal physicians, eager to demonstrate their learning, might prescribe complex remedies that had no medical value or even caused additional complications. They had access to exotic substances like ground pearls, powdered unicorn horn, and rare herbs. But these expensive medicines were no more effective than the simple remedies used by village midwives. Queen Philippa of Hainault, wife of Edward III, survived 13 pregnancies but watched several of her children die in infancy. Her experiences illustrate the particular pressures faced by royal women, who were expected to produce not just children, but specifically male heirs to secure the succession. The failure to produce surviving sons could destabilize entire kingdoms, placing enormous psychological pressure on royal mothers. The pressure on royal women to produce male heirs meant that they often faced pregnancy after pregnancy with little time to recover between births. Court physicians, influenced by classical texts that emphasized the importance of frequent intercourse for conception, sometimes recommended that queens become pregnant again as soon as possible after giving birth. This practice weakened their bodies and increased their risks of complications in subsequent pregnancies. Royal women also faced unique dangers related to political intrigue and court life. There were frequent rumors of poisoning attempts during royal pregnancies, leading to elaborate precautions around food and drink. The stress of court politics, combined with the physical demands of frequent pregnancies, created a toxic environment that may have contributed to pregnancy complications. Even when royal physicians attended births, their interventions were often more harmful than helpful. They might prescribe bloodletting to balance the humors, weakening women who were already fragile from childbirth. They recommended consuming ground unicorn horn, powdered pearls, or other exotic substances that had no medical value but were expensive enough to seem impressive. The elaborate nature of royal medical care often masked its fundamental ineffectiveness. The presence of male physicians at births was controversial throughout medieval society, but it was more common among royalty than among peasants. It was considered improper for men to see women in such a state, so male physicians often had to diagnose and treat based on secondhand descriptions from midwives. This indirect approach meant that they often missed crucial symptoms or misunderstood the nature of complications. When royal births went wrong, the political implications could be enormous. The death of a queen in childbirth might trigger succession crises, wars of inheritance, or political instability that could last for generations. The death of Eleanor of Castile in 1290, though not directly related to childbirth, led to significant changes in English politics and Edward I's approach to governance. The elaborate mourning rituals that followed royal deaths in childbirth reflected both genuine grief and political necessity. The king needed to demonstrate proper sorrow while also beginning the process of finding a new wife to continue the royal line. These competing demands often created additional stress for royal families already dealing with grief and loss. Historical records suggest that maternal mortality rates in medieval Europe ranged from 700 to 1,500 deaths per 100,000 births, though these numbers likely underestimate the true toll, as many deaths went unrecorded, particularly among peasant families. This means that roughly 1 in every 100 births resulted in the mother's death. And when we consider that women typically gave birth multiple times, the lifetime risk of dying in childbirth was perhaps 1 in 10. To put this in perspective, modern maternal mortality rates in developed countries are less than 10 per 100,000 births. This represents a reduction in risk of more than 99%, one of the most dramatic improvements in human health outcomes in recorded history. A medieval woman was roughly 100 times more likely to die in childbirth than a woman today. Infant mortality was even higher than maternal mortality. More than 25% of babies died before their first birthday, and as many as half didn't survive to age 5. These staggering numbers shaped every aspect of medieval family life, from naming practices to inheritance law to emotional relationships between parents and children. The causes of infant mortality were numerous and often interrelated. Premature births had virtually no chance of survival, as there were no incubators or specialized care for early babies. Birth injuries that would be treatable today were often fatal. Infections that could be easily cured with modern antibiotics claimed countless young lives. Even minor complications like difficulty breathing or feeding problems could prove deadly. When we compare medieval Europe to other parts of the world during the same period, we find that the situation was not unique to Christian Europe. The Islamic world, despite having access to more advanced medical texts and surgical techniques, faced similar challenges. However, Islamic physicians like Al-Razi and Ibn Sina had developed more sophisticated understanding of anatomy and surgery, and their works occasionally made their way into European medical schools, though often in corrupted or incomplete translations. The medical schools that began to emerge in medieval Europe, such as those at Salerno and Montpellier, gradually introduced more systematic approaches to medical education. However, these institutions primarily trained male physicians who had little practical experience with childbirth, and their theoretical knowledge often conflicted with the empirical wisdom of experienced midwives. The tension between learned medicine and traditional midwifery practice created ongoing conflicts throughout the medieval period. University-trained physicians looked down on midwives as ignorant and superstitious, while midwives often had more practical experience and better outcomes than the learned doctors. This conflict would continue for centuries, with formal medical education only gradually incorporating the practical knowledge that midwives had accumulated through generations of experience. The spiritual and superstitious safeguards that surrounded medieval childbirth revealed a world where people desperately sought control over forces they couldn't understand. Saint Margaret of Antioch was the most commonly invoked protector of women in labor, but she was far from the only one. The pantheon of saints associated with childbirth was extensive, reflecting the deep human need for divine protection during life's most dangerous passage. Saint Dorothy, who had been martyred as a virgin, was believed to help with difficult deliveries, her purity thought to provide special protection for mothers and children. Saint Bridget of Ireland was called upon to ease labor pains, her association with fertility and healing making her a natural patron for birthing women. Saint Anne, the mother of the Virgin Mary, was invoked to protect both mother and child, her status as a grandmother figure providing comfort to women facing the dangers of childbirth. The stories of these saints were well known to medieval women and provided both comfort and practical guidance. Saint Margaret's legend told of how she had been swallowed by a dragon but had burst free from its belly, making her a natural patron for women hoping to deliver their babies safely. The imagery of breaking free from confinement resonated powerfully with women in labor, providing a spiritual framework for understanding the birth process. Before labor began, women would often pray to Saint Margaret, asking for her intercession and protection. Some would wear amulets bearing her image or carry written prayers in their clothing. Churches dedicated to Saint Margaret often became pilgrimage sites for pregnant women, who would travel considerable distances to pray at her shrine and seek her blessing for safe delivery. The practice of invoking multiple saints reflected the medieval understanding that different saints had different areas of expertise and influence. A woman in labor might pray to Saint Margaret for safe delivery, to Saint Dorothy for pain relief, and to Saint Anne for protection of her child. This polytheistic approach to saintly intercession allowed for a more nuanced and comprehensive spiritual strategy. Baptism of the unborn was another crucial concern that shaped medieval birthing practices. The Church taught that unbaptized infants who died could not enter heaven, a doctrine that caused enormous anxiety for pregnant women and their families. This belief led to the development of emergency baptism procedures that could be performed by midwives or even family members if no priest was available. If a baby was born showing signs of life but was clearly dying, the midwife would perform an emergency baptism, often using whatever water was available and speaking the words herself if no priest was present. This practice was officially sanctioned by the Church, which recognized that infant mortality was so high that waiting for a priest often meant losing the chance to save a soul. The theological implications of unbaptized infant death created ongoing anxiety throughout pregnancy. Women worried not just about the physical dangers of childbirth, but also about the spiritual fate of their unborn children. This dual concern shaped pregnancy practices, birth rituals, and post-birth procedures in profound ways. Some midwives carried consecrated water specifically for emergency baptisms, understanding that speed was often essential. The baptismal formula was simplified for emergency use, requiring only the words, "I baptize you in the name of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Spirit," while water was poured on the baby's head. This could be performed even if the baby was only partially born, as long as the head was accessible. The practice of baptizing babies who showed any sign of life, even if they were clearly dying, reflected the medieval belief that the moment of death was crucial for determining eternal fate. A baby who died unbaptized was thought to be condemned to limbo, a theological concept that caused enormous grief for bereaved parents. Astrological timing played a significant role in medieval childbirth practices, reflecting the widespread belief that celestial bodies influenced earthly events. Physicians and midwives consulted star charts to determine the most favorable times for various procedures, from beginning labor to cutting the umbilical cord. This practice combined elements of ancient astronomy, medical theory, and folk belief. The phase of the moon was considered especially important, with many believing that births during a waxing moon were more likely to be successful. The full moon was thought to be particularly auspicious for childbirth, while the new moon was considered dangerous. These beliefs led to attempts to time births according to lunar cycles, though the unpredictable nature of labor made such timing difficult to control. Certain zodiac signs were thought to govern different parts of the body, and the position of the planets at the time of birth was believed to influence the child's future health and character. A child born when Mars was ascendant might be thought to have a warrior's temperament, while one born under Venus might be inclined toward love and beauty. These astrological considerations influenced not only birthing practices, but also child-rearing approaches. The Church's relationship with astrological practices was complex and often contradictory. While official doctrine sometimes condemned astrology as superstitious, many clergy members quietly endorsed or even participated in astrological calculations related to childbirth. The use of astronomical knowledge to determine religious feast days and calculate Easter created a precedent for the religious use of celestial observations. Medieval calendars often included astrological information alongside religious feast days, making it easy for people to combine astronomical and spiritual considerations in planning important events. This integration of sacred and secular timekeeping reflected the medieval worldview that saw divine providence operating through natural phenomena. As infant mortality rates climbed and the pressure to save souls intensified, the practice of caesarean section on dying mothers became more common, though it was almost always performed as a last resort to save the baby's soul rather than its life. The Church had ruled that cutting open a dying mother to baptize her child was not only permissible, but morally required, leading to the development of crude surgical techniques that were performed with little regard for the mother's suffering. The caesarean section of medieval times bore little resemblance to the precise, sterile procedure we know today. It was typically performed with whatever sharp instruments were available, often a knife or razor used for other purposes. There was no anesthesia, no understanding of antiseptic technique, and no real knowledge of internal anatomy. The mother was usually either dying or already dead, and the procedure was performed in desperate haste by whoever was present. The motivation for medieval caesarean sections was primarily spiritual rather than medical. The goal was to extract the baby quickly enough to perform baptism before death, ensuring the child's soul could enter heaven. This spiritual imperative sometimes overrode considerations of the mother's comfort or dignity, creating moral dilemmas that haunted medieval society. The survival rate for mothers who underwent caesarean section was essentially zero until the very end of the medieval period. The procedure was understood to be fatal for the mother, which meant it was only attempted when she was already dying or dead. This created a terrible psychological burden for families, who had to choose between allowing both mother and child to die or saving the child's soul at the cost of the mother's life. The first documented case of a mother surviving the procedure was that of Jacob Neuffer's wife in Switzerland around 1500. Nufer was a pig castrator who, when faced with his wife's obstructed labor and unable to find a skilled surgeon, performed the operation himself using the same techniques he used on animals. Remarkably, both mother and baby survived, though this was considered nothing short of miraculous. The technique used in medieval cesarean sections was crude by modern standards. The incision was usually made vertically from the navel to the pubic bone, cutting through skin, muscle, and the uterine wall in one stroke. The baby would be extracted quickly, often without regard for injury, and then the surgeon would attempt to close the wounds using whatever materials were available, often horsehair, which was considered the strongest thread available. The closing of the incision was particularly problematic, as medieval surgeons had no understanding of the different layers of tissue that needed to be sutured separately. They would often simply pull the skin edges together and sew them shut, leaving the deeper wounds to heal or not heal on their own. This approach virtually guaranteed infection and death, even in the rare cases where the initial surgery was successful. The psychological impact of medieval cesarean section extended beyond the immediate family. The entire community would be aware that such a procedure was being performed, and the sounds of the mother's suffering would be audible to neighbors. This created a collective trauma that could affect community attitudes toward pregnancy and childbirth for generations. The horror of medieval cesarean section also influenced artistic and literary representations of childbirth. Religious art often depicted the procedure in the context of martyrdom, with the suffering mother portrayed as a saint-like figure whose sacrifice saved her child's soul. These images reinforce the idea that maternal death in childbirth was noble and spiritually meaningful. If a woman survived the immediate trauma of birth, she faced a 40-day period of lying in that was fraught with its own dangers. This period was based on biblical precedent, the time Mary spent in purification after giving birth to Jesus, and was considered essential for both physical and spiritual recovery. During this time, the new mother was expected to remain in bed, or at best, confined to a single room, attended by female relatives and neighbors. The lying-in period was governed by strict rules about what the new mother could eat, drink, and do. She was typically forbidden from leaving her room, receiving male visitors, or engaging in any strenuous activity. These restrictions were intended to protect her from spiritual contamination and physical harm, but they often created more problems than they solved. The medical practices during lying in often did more harm than good. Bloodletting was commonly prescribed to restore the balance of humors, weakening women who were already fragile from childbirth. The theory was that childbirth created an excess of blood and heat in the body, which needed to be reduced through bleeding. In reality, new mothers were often anemic from blood loss during delivery and needed to conserve, not lose, more blood. The new mother might be given purifying baths made with ale and herbs, but these were often prepared in contaminated water or vessels that hadn't been properly cleaned. The concept of sterilization didn't exist, so even well-intentioned hygiene practices could introduce dangerous bacteria. The warm, moist environment of these baths could also promote bacterial growth. The confinement itself, while intended to promote rest, often led to complications like blood clots or infections from lack of movement. Modern medicine recognizes that early mobilization after childbirth is important for preventing complications. But medieval understanding emphasized complete rest and immobility. The foods given to new mothers during lying in reflected medieval understanding of nutrition and medicine, but often failed to provide the nutrients actually needed for recovery. Caudle, a warm drink made from ale, eggs, and spices, was considered essential for restoring strength. While this drink did provide some protein and calories, it was often the only substantial nutrition the new mother received for days. Broths made from chicken or other poultry were thought to be particularly nourishing, and this practice was actually beneficial, as these foods provided easily digestible protein and nutrients. Red wine was often prescribed for its supposed ability to restore blood, though this probably did more harm than good for women who were already dehydrated and needed rest rather than alcohol. The emphasis on liquid foods during lying in was based on the belief that solid foods were too difficult for the weakened body to digest. While this approach had some merit for women who were genuinely weak from difficult births, it often left new mothers undernourished at a time when they needed extra nutrition for healing. and if they were breastfeeding, for milk production. The isolation of lying in took a severe psychological toll on new mothers. They were separated from their normal activities and social connections at a time when they most needed support. The medieval household didn't stop functioning during a woman's lying-in period, so she would often lie in bed listening to the sounds of daily life continuing without her, unable to participate in caring for her other children or managing household affairs. The infant mortality rate was so high that many women spent these weeks in constant fear that their babies would die. They might be afraid to become too attached to their newborns, knowing that the chances of survival were poor. This emotional distance was a survival mechanism that protected parents from the devastation of repeated losses, but it also prevented the formation of strong maternal bonds. The combination of physical weakness, hormonal changes, and social isolation often led to what we would now recognize as postpartum depression. However, medieval people understood this condition very differently, attributing mood changes and emotional difficulties to spiritual rather than medical causes. A woman who seemed sad, anxious, or disconnected after giving birth might be thought to be suffering from demonic influence or divine punishment for some sin. The treatments prescribed for postpartum emotional difficulties, more prayer, more isolation, sometimes even exorcism, often made the condition worse rather than better. Women who were already struggling with depression might be subjected to additional spiritual scrutiny, creating a cycle of guilt and despair that could last long after the lying-in period ended. The churching ceremony that marked the end of lying in was both a celebration and a reminder of women's supposedly sinful nature. Based on the biblical account of Mary's purification, the ceremony involved the new mother being blessed by a priest and symbolically cleansed before she could resume her normal activities. This ritual provided closure and a sense of reintegration into the community, but it also reinforced the idea that childbirth was somehow polluting and that women needed to be purified before they could fully participate in Christian society. The churching ceremony typically took place 40 days after birth, assuming both mother and child had survived. The new mother would dress in her finest clothes and proceed to the church, often accompanied by female relatives and friends. She would offer candles or other gifts to the church, receive the priest's blessing, and then be symbolically welcomed back into the community. For many women, the churching ceremony was the first time they left their homes since giving birth, making it an important milestone in their recovery. However, the religious framework of the ceremony emphasized purification from sin rather than celebration of survival, sending mixed messages about the value and meaning of women's reproductive experiences. To understand the full impact of medieval childbirth mortality, we must consider not just the individual tragedies, but the broader social and economic effects that rippled through entire communities. High maternal mortality rates meant that many children grew up without mothers, creating a society where stepmothers and extended family networks played crucial roles in child-rearing. The frequent remarriage of widowed fathers was often an economic necessity rather than a romantic choice. The constant threat of death in childbirth influenced everything from marriage arrangements to inheritance law. Wealthy families might arrange marriages with multiple potential brides in mind, knowing that death in childbirth was a real possibility. Marriage contracts often included detailed provisions for the care of children in case of maternal death, and inheritance laws had to account for the frequent loss of mothers. The economic impact of losing mothers extended beyond individual families to entire communities. Women in medieval society were responsible for numerous economic activities: food preparation and preservation, textile production, herb cultivation, and childcare. When a mother died, these economic functions had to be redistributed among surviving family members or community networks, creating additional burdens for already struggling households. The loss of experienced mothers also meant the loss of accumulated knowledge about household management, childcare, and traditional crafts. This knowledge was typically passed down from mother to daughter through hands-on teaching and observation. When mothers died young, this transmission of knowledge was interrupted, potentially affecting the entire community's capacity for self-sufficiency. The numbers become even more staggering when we consider them in their full social context. If we estimate that maternal mortality was somewhere between 700 and 1,500 deaths per 100,000 births, and we know that women typically gave birth multiple times, the cumulative risk was enormous. Some historians suggest that as many as 1 in 10 women died from complications related to pregnancy and childbirth over the course of their reproductive lives. These mortality rates had profound effects on family structure and social organization. The nuclear family, as we understand it today, was often unstable due to the high rates of maternal and infant mortality. Extended family networks, including grandparents, aunts, uncles, and cousins, played much more important roles in medieval society than they do today, partly because they served as safety nets when nuclear families were disrupted by death. The high stakes of medieval childbirth shaped European society in ways that continued long after medical advances reduced mortality rates. The legal framework governing women's property rights, the social expectations surrounding marriage and motherhood, and even the development of charitable institutions were all influenced by the harsh realities of maternal mortality. Religious institutions developed extensive networks for caring for orphan children, recognizing that maternal death was common enough to require systematic responses. Monasteries and convents often served as orphanages, providing care for children whose mothers had died in childbirth. These institutions shaped the development of European social services for centuries to come. The need to ensure the survival of at least some children led to the practice of having large families, which in turn put enormous strain on women's bodies and family resources. The medieval ideal of the large family was partly a response to high mortality rates. If half of children died before reaching adulthood, then having 8 or 10 children might result in 4 or 5 survivors. This reproductive strategy placed enormous physical demands on women, who might face pregnancy and childbirth repeatedly throughout their reproductive years. The constant cycle of pregnancy, birth, and recovery left many women physically depleted and more vulnerable to complications in subsequent pregnancies. The cumulative effect of multiple pregnancies often aged women prematurely and shortened their lifespans. Inheritance law was profoundly shaped by the realities of maternal mortality. The complex rules governing the transfer of property in case of a woman's death in childbirth, the provisions for stepchildren, and the legal status of widowed fathers all reflected a society that had to plan for the frequent loss of mothers. These legal frameworks influenced European property law for centuries and can still be seen in some modern legal systems. Royal succession was particularly vulnerable to the uncertainties of childbirth. Entire dynasties could be affected by the death of a queen in childbirth or the loss of male heirs in infancy. The English succession crisis that led to the War of the Roses was partly caused by the failure of various royal women to produce surviving male heirs, demonstrating how individual birth outcomes could shape national history. The Church's doctrine on marriage and sexuality was also influenced by these harsh realities. The emphasis on women's primary role as mothers, the restrictions on contraception, and the complex theology surrounding the salvation of unbaptized infants all reflected a society grappling with high mortality rates. The veneration of the Virgin Mary took on special significance in a world where motherhood was literally a matter of life and death. The theological implications of high infant mortality created ongoing tensions within church doctrine. The belief that unbaptized infants could not enter heaven conflicted with the reality that many babies died before baptism could be performed. This led to the development of the concept of limbo, a theological compromise that attempted to address the fate of unbaptized infants without undermining the importance of baptism. Family correspondence from the medieval period provides heartbreaking glimpses into the personal toll of these losses. The Paston family letters, which survive from 15th century England, include references to prayers for God's mercy in the birthing bed, and discussions of the practical arrangements that needed to be made when a woman died in childbirth. These documents reveal how families planned for the possibility of maternal death, making arrangements for the care of surviving children and the management of household affairs. These letters also show how the constant threat of death in childbirth affected family relationships and emotional life. Expressions of love and affection between spouses were often tempered by the recognition that pregnancy could end in loss. The medieval concept of romantic love developed alongside an acute awareness of mortality, creating a literary and cultural tradition that emphasized both passion and loss. The ripple effects of losing mothers in childbirth extended far beyond the immediate family. Communities lost skilled workers, healers, and leaders. Women often served as informal community leaders, organizing mutual aid networks, preserving and transmitting cultural traditions, and providing informal medical care. When experienced mothers died, these community functions had to be redistributed or lost entirely. The constant threat of maternal death created a culture of fear around female sexuality and reproduction, contributing to the oppression of women and the limitation of their roles in society. If pregnancy was seen as potentially fatal, then women's primary social function was also their greatest vulnerability. This paradox shaped medieval attitudes toward women and influenced gender relations for centuries. The economic burden of supporting motherless children often fell on extended family networks or religious institutions. Charitable organizations developed specifically to care for orphans, and these institutions became important features of medieval social organization. The scale of maternal mortality meant that such institutions were essential rather than supplementary features of medieval society. But perhaps most tragically, the high maternal mortality rates meant that countless women lived in constant fear of pregnancy. For married women, pregnancy was often inevitable, given the lack of effective contraception and the social pressure to produce children. Each conception brought with it the very real possibility of death, creating a climate of anxiety that pervaded women's lives. Letters and diaries from the period reveal the complex emotions surrounding pregnancy announcements. Joy at the prospect of a new child was tempered by fear of the dangers ahead. Women made wills and arranged for the care of their existing children before giving birth, knowing that they might not survive the experience. These preparations were practical necessities rather than morbid preoccupations. The persistence of these conditions throughout the medieval period, and indeed for centuries beyond, speaks to the fundamental limitations of pre-modern medicine. Without understanding of bacteria and infection, without anesthesia or surgical techniques, without knowledge of anatomy and physiology, medieval healers were fighting against forces they couldn't see or understand. Their remedies, while sometimes based on accurate observation, were often powerless against the complications that made childbirth so dangerous. Yet it's important to recognize that medieval people were not passive victims of these circumstances. They developed sophisticated social support networks for pregnant women, created rituals and practices that provided emotional comfort, and passed down through generations the practical knowledge that did help some women survive. The midwives of medieval Europe were often skilled and experienced practitioners who, within the limitations of their time, saved many lives. The gradual improvements that would eventually transform childbirth began to emerge in the later medieval period and accelerated during the Renaissance. The rediscovery of classical medical texts, particularly the works of ancient Greek physicians, provided new insights into anatomy and physiology. The development of better surgical instruments, including improved designs for cesarean sections, slowly reduced some risks. The invention of the printing press allowed medical knowledge to spread more widely and accurately than ever before. Manuscripts that had been copied by hand for centuries could now be reproduced exactly, reducing the errors and corruptions that had accumulated over time. Medical textbooks became more standardized, and the exchange of knowledge between practitioners became more efficient. The establishment of formal medical schools began to create more standardized training for practitioners, though these institutions were initially focused on training male physicians rather than midwives. The tension between learned medicine and traditional midwifery practice continued throughout this period, with formal education only gradually incorporating the practical knowledge that experienced midwives possessed. But the real breakthrough would come much later, with the development of antiseptic technique in the 19th century. The recognition that invisible microorganisms could cause infection revolutionized surgical practice and dramatically reduced mortality rates. The simple practice of hand washing with antiseptic solutions, when properly implemented, prevented countless infections and saved thousands of lives. The discovery of antibiotics in the 20th century completed the transformation of childbirth from a potentially fatal ordeal into a generally safe experience. Infections that had killed women for centuries could now be cured with simple medications. Puerperal fever, which had been a death sentence in medieval times, became a treatable condition with low mortality rates. Modern obstetrics combines the best of traditional midwifery knowledge with advanced medical technology. The birthing positions favored by medieval midwives have been validated by modern research, while technological advances like fetal monitoring and ultrasound allow for early detection of complications. The cesarean section, once a desperate last resort, has become a routine procedure that saves countless lives when properly performed. As we near the end of our long journey together through this difficult chapter of human history, I want to leave you with a sense of the remarkable progress that has been made, but also with an appreciation for the courage and resilience of the women who face these dangers with grace and determination. The horrors of medieval childbirth, the infections that killed silently, the hemorrhages that stole life in minutes, the superstitions that sometimes hindered more than helped, have been largely conquered through human ingenuity, scientific advancement, and the tireless work of medical professionals. The three core reasons why childbirth was so deadly in the Middle Ages can be summarized as a perfect storm of ignorance and circumstance. First, the complete lack of knowledge about infection and how to prevent it meant that every birth carried the risk of deadly bacteria entering the mother's bloodstream. Second, the absence of effective techniques for managing complications like hemorrhage and obstructed labor meant that treatable conditions became death sentences. And finally, the interference of superstitious beliefs and harmful medical theories sometimes prevented the application of what little helpful knowledge was available. These factors combined to create a situation where bringing life into the world was itself a gamble with death. Every woman who became pregnant knew that she might not survive to hold her child. Every family that celebrated a pregnancy also prepared for the possibility of loss. Every community developed rituals and support systems designed to cope with the regular tragedy of maternal death. But from these dark times emerged the gradual development of the medical knowledge that protects women today. Each generation of healers built upon the knowledge of their predecessors, slowly accumulating the understanding that would eventually transform childbirth. The introduction of antiseptic technique, the discovery of antibiotics, and the development of modern obstetrics represent the culmination of centuries of human effort to conquer one of our species' greatest challenges. The journey from medieval birthing chambers lit by flickering candles to modern delivery rooms equipped with advanced monitoring equipment represents one of humanity's greatest triumphs over suffering and death. Every woman who gives birth today in safety stands on the shoulders of countless mothers who came before, whose struggles and sacrifices contributed to the gradual accumulation of knowledge that makes modern obstetrics possible. The statistical transformation is breathtaking in its scope. A reduction in maternal mortality from perhaps 1 in every 100 births to fewer than 1 in every 10,000 births represents a 99% improvement in outcomes. This change has liberated women from the fear that had shadowed pregnancy for millennia and has allowed families to plan and dream with confidence rather than dread. Yet we must also remember that this transformation is not complete or universal. In many parts of the world today, women still face risks that are reminiscent of medieval Europe. Access to skilled birth attendants, clean facilities, and emergency medical care remains limited in many regions. The work of reducing maternal mortality continues, driven by the same humanitarian impulses that motivated medieval midwives and modern obstetricians alike. As you prepare to rest tonight, perhaps you'll spare a thought for all those women whose stories we've shared. Marjorie, struggling through her difficult labor in a one-room cottage. The queens who faced the same dangers despite their wealth and power. The midwives who did their best with the knowledge they had. And the countless others whose names we'll never know, but whose experiences remind us how precious and fragile life truly is. The story of medieval childbirth is ultimately a story about human resilience, about the capacity to find hope and meaning even in the face of terrible odds. It's a reminder that progress is possible, that knowledge can triumph over ignorance, and that the application of human reason and compassion can overcome even the most daunting challenges. In the quiet moments before sleep, you might reflect on the extraordinary privilege of living in an age when the dangerous passage from one world to the next, the journey every one of us has made from the womb to the world, has been made infinitely safer through the accumulated wisdom of centuries. The candles that once flickered in medieval birthing chambers have been replaced by the steady light of scientific knowledge, illuminating the path forward for generations yet to come. Sleep well, friend, in the knowledge that each dawn brings new possibilities for human flourishing and the continued conquest of suffering. May your dreams be peaceful, and may you wake with a renewed appreciation for the remarkable journey that has brought us from those dark medieval chambers to the bright promise of modern medicine. The story of progress continues, written in the countless small victories of healers and researchers who work each day to make the world a little safer, a little kinder, and a little more hopeful for all who enter it.